welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. Day 1 Field Notes from the Merchandise Mart Foundation Survey. My name is Nolan Cormier, and I document what others prefer to forget. As Chicago's lead urban archaeologist, I've spent 15 years cataloging the bones beneath our steel giants. But what I found today in the Merchandise Mart's subbasement changes everything. The foundation stones bled ichor into the subway tunnels. I should start from the beginning. The city contracted me to survey the building's structural integrity before the planned renovation. Standard work, measuring load-bearing walls, documenting original construction materials, checking for historical artifacts that might complicate the project. My grandfather taught me to respect the old ways, even in a city that rebuilds itself every generation. Grandpère Cormier brought war designs from Quebec, protective symbols carved into door frames and foundation stones. "The earth remembers," he used to say, tracing the intricate patterns with calloused fingers. Even when men forget, I carry his leather journal everywhere, filled with sketches of protective runes and binding circles. Most people call it folklore. I call it insurance. The Merchandise Mart's basement levels descend deeper than the original blueprints indicate. The elevator shuddered to a stop at sub-level 3, but my flashlight revealed stairs continuing downward. The air grew thick with the smell of copper and wet stone, something that shouldn't exist in a building constructed in 1930. Sub-level 4 stretched into darkness, carved from Chicago's bedrock rather than built. The walls bore marks that made my skin crawl, symbols that looked almost familiar, like corrupted versions of Grandpère's protective wards. But these weren't carved to protect. They were carved to summon. The altar sat in the center of the chamber, a massive slab of black stone that seemed to absorb my flashlight's beam. Runes covered its surface, carved deep and filled with something that gleamed wetly in the darkness. Blood. Fresh blood that trickled from the stone's pores like sweat. I approached carefully, pulling out my grandfather's journal for comparison. The symbols were wrong, inverted, twisted, corrupted. Where Grandpère's wards formed protective circles, these runes formed binding chains. Where his designs channeled safety, these channeled something else entirely. The blood pooled at the altar's base, seeping through cracks in the bedrock. It moved with purpose, following carved channels that led to 4 smaller stones positioned at the chamber's corners. Each stone bore a different symbol, and each wept the same crimson tears. I started photographing everything, my camera flash illuminating details that made my stomach turn. The altar wasn't just stained with blood, it was fed by it. Tubes ran from the chamber above, disappearing into the building's structure. Someone had been feeding this thing. My phone buzzed. A text from my brother Mason. "How's the survey going? Find any ghosts in the basement." If only he knew. I took measurements, made sketches, tried to approach this like any other archaeological site. But the blood kept flowing, and the symbols seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision. The air itself felt thick, charged with the same electricity that precedes a thunderstorm. Then I heard it, a low humming that seemed to come from the stone itself. The altar was singing. The sound grew louder, resonating through the bedrock beneath my feet. My instruments started registering microtremors, tiny earthquakes that shouldn't exist this far from any fault line. The blood began to glow, a faint phosphorescence that made the runes appear to writhe. I backed away, fumbling for my phone to record the sound. The humming peaked, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, a dead quiet that seemed to swallow sound itself. That's when I noticed the cracks spreading across the chamber's ceiling. Hairline fractures that hadn't been there moments before. The building was responding to whatever was happening down here. I ran. The elevator ride to street level felt like an eternity. My ears popped from pressure changes that shouldn't occur in a building. By the time I reached the lobby, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my equipment. The security guard, an elderly man named Peters, looked at me with concern. "You okay, Doc? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I managed. "Peters, how long has this building been having structural problems?" He shrugged. "Couple months now. Started with little tremors, nothing major. But lately..." He gestured toward a hairline crack running up the marble wall. "Management's been real quiet about it. Brought in some consultants, but they don't talk to us regular folks." I studied the crack more carefully. It followed the same pattern as the channels carved around the altar below. The building itself was becoming part of the ritual. "These consultants," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What did they look like?" "Corporate types. Expensive suits, fancy equipment. Real secretive about their work. They've been coming and going at all hours, always heading straight for the basement levels." Peters leaned closer. "Between you and me, Doc, I don't think they're fixing anything. Place feels wrong now, like it's waiting for something." I thanked Peters and stepped outside, needing fresh air and sunlight. But even on the street, I could feel it. A pulse beneath the pavement, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The altar was still singing, too low for normal hearing but loud enough to shake the city's foundations. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Minor earthquake reported in downtown Chicago. Magnitude 2.1. No damage reported. No damage visible, maybe, but I knew better. This was just the beginning. I called Mason as I walked to my car. "Hey, remember Grandpa's ward designs? The ones carved into our childhood home's foundation? Yeah, the old protection symbols. Why? I need you to meet me tonight. Bring your tools, the ones you use for construction work. And Mason, yeah, bring a lot of silver. We're going to need it." The drive home gave me time to think, to plan. Grandpa's journal contained more than just protective wards. It held binding rituals, ways to contain what shouldn't be released. If someone was perverting his designs, twisting them into summoning circles, then his knowledge might be the only thing that could stop them. But first, I had to warn the city. The merchandise mart was just one building. If there were altars in other foundations, other ritual sites hidden beneath Chicago's skyline, the tremors I'd felt were just the beginning. Something was waking up beneath the city, something that had been sleeping in the bedrock for longer than any of us realized. The corporate consultants weren't trying to fix structural problems. They were causing them. I parked outside my apartment and sat in the darkness, Grandpa's journal heavy in my lap. The leather binding felt warm, almost alive. His words echoed in my memory. "The earth remembers, Nolan, even when men forget." Tonight, I would make sure the city remembered too. Before it was too late, the foundation stones bled ichor into the subway tunnels, and somewhere in the darkness below, something ancient stirred in response. Chicago's steel bones were about to learn what it meant to bleed. Day 3, emergency documentation. The skyline trembled as blood rose through the concrete. Mason arrived at my apartment with a duffel bag full of construction tools and enough silver wire to rewire a small building. My younger brother has always been the practical one. While I study the past, he builds the future. But tonight, we were both racing against something that threatened to bury Chicago's future beneath its bleeding foundations. "You look like hell, Nolan," he said, dumping his tools on my Kitherson table. "When's the last time you slept?" I hadn't slept since discovering the altar. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that humming, felt the tremors spreading through the bedrock. "Sleep can wait. Look at this." I spread Grandpa's journal across the table alongside my photographs from the merchandise mart. Mason's expression shifted from concern to disbelief as he compared the twisted runes with our grandfather's protective designs. "These are wrong," he said, tracing a corrupted symbol with his finger. It's like someone took grandpa's wards and turned them inside out. Exactly. And there are more sites. I spent yesterday checking city records. Every building that's reported structural problems in the past 6 months has the same construction company listed for recent foundation work. I pulled out a map of downtown Chicago, red X's marking nearly 24 locations. Helix Construction Corporation. They've been busy. Mason studied the pattern. His engineer's mind immediately grasped what I was seeing. They're not random. Look, they follow the old riverbed, the original course of the Chicago River before it was reversed. And this concentration here, he pointed to the Loop District. That's sitting right on top of the old fort site. Fort Dearborn, I confirmed. Built on ground the Potawatomi considered sacred. If someone wanted to tap into the city's spiritual foundation, the apartment shook. Not gently. A sharp, violent tremor that rattled the windows and sent books tumbling from shelves. We both froze, listening. The shaking lasted 15 seconds, then stopped with an almost audible snap. My phone immediately started buzzing with emergency alerts. Earthquake, magnitude 3.4, epicenter downtown Chicago. Then another alert, gas leak reported on Michigan Avenue. Another, structural damage reported at Willis Tower. It's starting, I said. The ritual network is activating. Mason was already reaching for his tools. Then we stop it. You said grandpa's designs could create protective barriers, in theory, but we'd need to get close to the sites, and if they're all connected. I stared at the map, my mind racing. If we disrupt one incorrectly, we could trigger the entire network. Another tremor, stronger this time. Through the window, I could see car alarms going off across the neighborhood. In the distance, emergency sirens wailed. We can't do this alone, Mason said. We need to warn people. Get them away from the ritual sites. I thought of Peters, the security guard at the merchandise mart. Of the thousands of people working in buildings that sat on top of bleeding altars. Who's going to believe us? Evacuate downtown because of ancient blood rituals? Then we make them believe. Mason pulled out his phone. I know people in the construction unions, city inspectors. If I report structural instabilities, unsafe foundations, they'll want evidence. Then we get evidence. The plan was dangerous, but it was better than watching Chicago collapse from the inside out. Mason would use his connections to trigger building inspections at the ritual sites, creating official reasons for evacuations. I would document everything, building a case that even skeptics couldn't ignore. We loaded Mason's truck with silver wire, construction equipment, and grandpa's journal. As we drove toward downtown, the tremors grew more frequent. Cracks appeared in the street, following patterns that looked disturbingly familiar. There, Mason pointed to a fissure running down State Street. That's following the old pneumatic postal system tunnels. The ones that connected all the major buildings in the loop. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The tunnels. They're using the old tunnel system to connect the ritual sites underground. Every altar feeds into the same network. Mason pulled over, and we both stared at the cracks spreading across the asphalt. It wasn't just a fissure. It was glowing, faintly, with the same phosphorescent light I'd seen in the altar chamber. Jesus, Mason whispered. It's not just the buildings. They've turned the entire downtown into one massive ritual site. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Peters, Merchandise Mart Security. Doc, you need to get down here. Peter's voice was strained, frightened. That basement level you were surveying? It's singing. The whole building's shaking, and there's this smell like copper and sulfur. Management's trying to evacuate, but the elevators aren't working right. Peters, listen to me carefully. Get everyone out of the building. Use the stairs. Avoid the basement levels entirely. And whatever you do, don't let anyone go down to sublevel 4. Too late for that, document. Those consultants went down there an hour ago. Haven't come back up. The line went dead. Mason and I exchanged looks. We have to choose, I said. Try to save the people in the merchandise mart, or work on stopping the entire network. That's not a choice, Mason said, putting the truck in gear. We save who we can. The drive to the merchandise mart took us through a city that was slowly coming apart. Streetlights flickered in patterns that hurt to look at. The Chicago River had turned a dark, oily color that reflected the light wrong. People stood on sidewalks, staring at cracks in building facades, at windows that had started to weep condensation that looked suspiciously like blood. The merchandise mart loomed ahead, its Art Deco facade now marred by spreading cracks that formed geometric patterns across the stone. The patterns looked like the corrupted versions of grandparents' wards, but larger, more complex. The building itself was becoming part of the ritual. Mason parked across the street, and we could both feel it. A pulse beneath the pavement, a rhythm that seemed to sync with our heartbeats. The altar was singing louder now, its voice joined by others throughout the city. A chorus of stone and blood and ancient hunger. The silver wire, I said, grabbing coils from the truck bed. If we can create a binding circle around the building's foundation, we might be able to contain whatever's happening inside. And if we can't, I looked up at the merchandise mart's towering bulk, at the windows beginning to glow with the same phosphorescent light I'd seen in the altar chamber. Then we pray grandparents' wards are stronger than whatever's trying to break free. We started at the building's northeast corner, Mason using his tools to anchor silver wire into the sidewalk while I consulted the journal for the proper binding patterns. The work was slow, dangerous. Each tremor threatened to snap the wire, and the air itself seemed to resist our efforts. Halfway around the building, Mason stopped. Nolan, look, the cracks in the merchandise mart's facade were spreading faster now, forming a network of fissures that connected to similar patterns on neighboring buildings. The ritual wasn't contained to single sites. It was spreading, turning the entire downtown into a massive summoning circle. We're too late, I said. The network is already active. No. Mason's voice was firm, determined. We're not too late. We're just getting started. He pulled out his phone, started making calls. Jimmy? It's Mason Levesque. I need you to listen carefully. Remember that emergency protocol we talked about for catastrophic structural failure? The one where you shut down power to the entire loop district? Yeah, that one. I need you to do it now. As Mason coordinated with his contacts throughout the city's infrastructure, I continued laying the silver wire, following grandparents' binding patterns. The journal felt hot in my hands, its leather binding warm as if it contained living energy. The building shuddered, and I heard screaming from inside. Not human screaming, something else. Something that had been sleeping in the stone and blood and was now waking up. The skyline trembled as blood rose through the concrete, and deep beneath Chicago's foundations, something ancient and hungry began to stir. Day 5 field report. The corporation's runes. The corporation's runes woke the beast beneath Chicago. Mason's emergency contacts had worked better than we'd hoped. By dawn, power to the Loop District was cut, forcing evacuations of 17 major buildings. The official story was catastrophic electrical failure, but I knew the truth. We'd temporarily disrupted the ritual network. The humming had stopped, the tremors had eased, and the blood seeping through foundation cracks had slowed to a trickle. But we'd only bought time. 3 hours, Mason said, checking his watch as we surveyed the darkened downtown from the roof of a parking garage. That's how long Jimmy says he can keep the power grid offline before the city forces him to restore it. Below us, Chicago's skyline stood silent and dark. Emergency vehicles crawled through streets lit only by flashlights and vehicle headlights. The National Guard had been called in, ostensibly to help with earthquake damage, but I could see their confusion. The cracks in buildings didn't follow any pattern they understood. The structural damage defied conventional explanation. That's not enough time to disrupt 24 ritual sites, I said, studying the map we'd spread across the roof. But it might be enough to find the source. Helix Construction Corp, Mason agreed. If they're behind this, they have to have a central command site. Somewhere they're coordinating the network from. I'd spent the previous night researching Helix construction, digging through city records and corporate filings. On the surface, they appeared legitimate, a mid-sized construction company specializing in foundation work and underground infrastructure. But the deeper I dug, the stranger things became. The company had been founded 6 months ago, immediately after the Chicago Historical Society had announced the discovery of pre-Columbian artifacts during a routine archaeological survey, the same survey that had been classified and sealed by order of the city council. "I found something," I told Mason, pulling out a folder of documents I'd copied from the city archives. The original archaeological report from the site where they built the first Helix project. "Look at these photos." The images showed carved stone chambers deep beneath the Chicago River, symbols that made my skin crawl with recognition. They were older than grandpa's wards, more primitive, but the intent was clear. These were binding circles, prison cells carved into the bedrock itself. "Someone was keeping something locked up down there," Mason said, studying the photographs. "And now someone's trying to let it out." I compared the ancient symbols with the corrupted wards I documented at the merchandise mart. The ritual sites aren't summoning something new. They're breaking seals that have been in place for centuries. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Dr. Cormier?" The voice was male, nervous, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "My name is Tristan Gerard. I work for Helix Construction. I need to meet with you. It's about the ritual sites." Mason grabbed my arm, shaking his head. Could be a trap, a way to silence the only people who understood what was happening. But the desperation in the caller's voice sounded genuine. "Where?" I asked. "Navy Pier, the old carousel building." 20 minutes. The line went dead. Mason insisted on coming with me, bringing his tool bag and enough silver wire to create a protective circle if needed. The drive to Navy Pier took us through empty streets, past buildings that still showed signs of the morning's earthquake. Cracked facades, broken windows, foundations that wept condensation like tears. The carousel building stood dark and empty, its colorful horses frozen in mid-gallop. Tristan Gerard waited for us inside, a thin man in his 40s wearing a construction worker's hard hat and safety vest. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "I helped build them," he said without preamble. "The altar chambers. I thought we were just doing unusual foundation work, specialized basement construction. But 3 days ago, I saw what we'd actually created." He pulled out a tablet showing us construction blueprints that made my blood run cold. Detailed plans for ritual chambers, precise measurements for altar placement, specifications for the channels that would carry blood between sites. Every building on my map was represented, but there were more sites I hadn't identified yet. "There are 37 locations," Tristan continued, "connected by the old tunnel system, the pneumatic postal tubes, even the abandoned subway lines. The entire downtown is wired like a circuit board." "Who's running this?" Mason demanded. "Who gave you these plans?" "Helix Construction is just the front. The real money, the real power." Tristan's hands shook harder as he pulled up another file. "It's a consortium. Corporate executives, city officials, even some federal agencies. They call themselves the Convergence Initiative." The tablet showed photographs of men in expensive suits standing around ritual circles, their faces illuminated by the glow of carved runes. I recognized some of them: the mayor's chief of staff, the head of the city planning commission, executives from major Chicago corporations. "They believe the seals are weakening anyway," Tristan said. "Climate change, urban development, the natural settling of the bedrock. They think it's better to control the release than to wait for it to happen randomly." "Control the release of what?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Tristan showed us the final file on his tablet. Archaeological surveys from the 1800s, when Chicago was first being built. Accounts of construction workers who'd disappeared while digging foundations. Reports of strange sounds from beneath the city, of tools that came back up from deep excavations covered in substances that weren't quite blood. The Potawatomi called it the hungry dark, Tristan said. Something that lived in the spaces between the earth and stone, feeding on the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beneath. The early settlers thought they'd contained it by building on top of it, weighing it down with steel and concrete. But they only made it stronger. Mason studied the blueprints, his engineer's mind working through the implications. This network, it's not just breaking the seals, it's feeding the thing underneath. Every ritual site is pouring energy into a central location. Where? I asked. Tristan highlighted a location on the map that made my stomach drop. The old City Hall building, the one that was demolished in 1965. They built the current Civic Center on top of it, but the foundation chambers are still there. That's where the primary altar is located. The Civic Center, Mason said grimly, the heart of Chicago's government. If something breaks free there, it won't just destroy the city, I finished. It'll have access to everything: government communications, emergency services, the power grid. Tristan nodded. The Convergence Initiative believes they can bargain with it, offer it controlled feeding in exchange for cooperation. They think they can make a deal. People who make deals with things like this, I said, thinking of grandpa's warnings about entities that hungered for more than food, usually end up as the meal. Another tremor shook the building, stronger than before. The carousel horses began to move, their painted eyes gleaming in the darkness as they slowly rotated around the central axis. The power was still out, but something was animating the mechanism anyway. They're restoring the network, Tristan said, checking his phone. Emergency power is being routed to the ritual sites. The feeding is about to resume. Through the windows, I could see lights flickering on throughout downtown Chicago. But they weren't electric lights. They were the phosphorescent glow of activated runes, of altars that had tasted blood and were hungry for more. We need to get to the Civic Center, I said. If the primary altar is there, that's where we can stop this. Stop it. Tristan laughed bitterly. Dr. Cormier, you don't understand. The Convergence Initiative has been planning this for decades. They have resources, connections, government backing. What do we have? Mason hefted his tool bag, the silver wire gleaming in the carousel's eerie glow. We have grandpa's wards, and we have each other. And, I added, studying the construction blueprints on Tristan's tablet, we have someone who knows exactly how these ritual chambers were built. Tristan stared at us for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. The Convergence Initiative meets at midnight for the final phase. That's when they'll complete the primary ritual. How long do we have? Mason asked. I checked my watch. The carousel continued its slow rotation, the horses' painted smiles looking more like grimaces in the phosphorescent light filtering through the windows. 6 hours, I said. 6 hours to save Chicago from something that's been waiting centuries to feed. The corporation's runes woke the beast beneath Chicago, and now it was up to us to put it back to sleep before it devoured everything we loved. Day 5 Field Report. The ritual drowned downtown. The ritual drowned downtown in ichor and steel. 3 hours. That's how long we had before the Convergence Initiative's midnight gathering, and already the city was bleeding. The emergency power restoration had triggered something far worse than the morning's tremors. As we raced through Chicago's streets in Mason's construction truck, I watched the Skyline transform into something from a nightmare. The Willis Tower's foundation glowed with veins of sickly phosphorescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. The merchandise mart wept streams of dark ichor that pooled in the streets, carrying the acrid stench of something that had never been alive but hungered nonetheless. Jesus Christ, Mason whispered, steering around a fissure that had split LaSalle Street in half. It's like the whole city is dissolving. Tristan sat in the passenger seat, his construction tablet showing real-time readings from sensors he'd helped install in the ritual chambers. The network is operating at 70% capacity, he reported, but the readings are wrong. The energy levels are spiking beyond anything we designed for. I studied the readouts over his shoulder. The numbers meant nothing to me, but the trend was clear. Whatever was happening beneath Chicago was accelerating, growing stronger with each passing minute. The Convergence Initiative has lost control. Haven't they? They never had control, Tristan said grimly. They just convinced themselves they did. My phone rang. Caleb Valancourt's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. Nolan, where the hell are you? His voice was tight with controlled panic. I've got reports of structural failures throughout the loop. The National Guard is requesting immediate evacuation of all downtown buildings, but we don't have the resources to move 200,000 people. Caleb, listen to me carefully, I said. This isn't a natural disaster. There's a ritual network beneath the city, and it's breaking containment seals that have been in place for centuries. You need to focus evacuations on the areas around the ritual sites. Ritual sites? Even through the phone, I could hear the disbelief in his voice. Nolan, I need facts, not folklore. The facts are that Chicago is about to be consumed by something that's been sleeping under the bedrock for centuries. I snapped. Check the pattern of the structural failures. I guarantee they're centered on buildings constructed by Helix Construction Corporation. There was a pause. Then, how did you know that? We haven't released those details to the public because I've been tracking this for 5 days. Caleb, I'm sending you a list of addresses. These are the primary ritual sites. If you can't evacuate the entire loop, at least clear those buildings. Another tremor shook the truck, strong enough to crack the windshield. Through the spider web of broken glass, I watched the Trump Tower's foundation begin to glow with the same phosphorescent veins that were spreading throughout downtown. The building swayed slightly, as if something massive was moving beneath it. I'm on it, Caleb said. But Nolan, whatever you're planning, be careful. The city's emergency services are stretched beyond capacity. If something goes wrong, we can't help you. The line went dead as Mason pulled the truck into an alley behind the Civic Center. The building loomed above us, its brutalist architecture looking more ominous than usual in the glow of the activated runes. But it wasn't just the building that had changed. The very air around it seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if reality itself was being compressed by the weight of what lay beneath. The service entrance is around back, Tristan said, checking his tablet. But the readings from the primary altar chamber are off the charts. Whatever's down there, it's not just hungry anymore. It's angry. Mason grabbed his tool bag and the coils of silver wire. Grandpère always said that anger makes entities predictable. If we can channel that rage, maybe we can turn it against the ritual network. We made our way to the service entrance, past dumpsters that were somehow bleeding the same dark ichor that seeped from the building's foundations. The door was locked, but Mason made short work of it with his tools. The stairwell beyond was lit by emergency lighting, but the red glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with the phosphorescent veins that ran through the walls. The altar chamber is 3 levels down, Tristan whispered as we descended. But there are security checkpoints. The Convergence Initiative isn't taking any chances. The first checkpoint was abandoned, its guards having fled when the building began to bleed. The second was manned by 2 men in expensive suits who looked more like corporate executives than security personnel. They were so focused on their tablets, monitoring the ritual network's progress, that they didn't notice us until Mason's silver wire was already wrapped around their ankles. What the hell? One of them started to say, then screamed as the wire began to smoke against his skin. Whatever the Convergence Initiative had done to align themselves with the entity beneath Chicago, it had left them vulnerable to the old protections. Where's the primary altar? I demanded, but the man was too busy writhing in pain to answer. His companion was already unconscious, the silver wire having burned through his flesh to the bone. This way, Tristan said, leading us down a corridor that hadn't existed on any of the building's original blueprints. They excavated this level specifically for the ritual chamber. The corridor ended in a set of double doors marked with symbols that made my eyes water to look at them directly. The same binding circles I'd seen in the archaeological photographs, but carved in reverse, not to contain something, but to release it. Mason pushed open the doors, and we stepped into hell. The ritual chamber was vast, carved from the bedrock itself and lit by the glow of dozens of altars arranged in a complex geometric pattern. Each altar was different, some made from steel and concrete, others from carved stone that predated Chicago's founding. But all of them were active, all of them weeping streams of dark ichor that flowed through channels cut into the floor toward a central pit. And around the pit, 13 figures in expensive suits stood in a circle, their voices raised in a chant that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with malevolent energy. "The Convergence Initiative," Tristan breathed. "They're actually doing it. They're trying to complete the summoning." But something was wrong. The figures weren't standing in triumph. They were backing away from the pit, their voices rising in panic rather than ritual ecstasy. Whatever was supposed to emerge from the darkness below wasn't cooperating with their plans. "It's not supposed to be like this," one of them shouted over the rising sound of something massive moving beneath the city. "The entity is supposed to be contained, controlled." The voice that answered came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the stone walls like the sound of grinding tectonic plates. "You pathetic insects think you can bargain with the hungry dark? You think you can feed me scraps and expect gratitude?" The pit began to glow with a light that hurt to look at directly. The ichor flowing from the altars caught fire, filling the chamber with flames that burned cold and cast no shadows. And something began to rise from the depths. Not a creature, but a presence, a weight that pressed against the mind like the memory of being buried alive. "The seals," Mason said, his voice tight with understanding. "They weren't just keeping it contained, they were keeping it sane. Centuries of imprisonment have driven it mad." One of the Convergence Initiative members, a woman I recognized as the mayor's chief of staff, pointed at us with a trembling hand. "Stop them. They're here to disrupt the ritual." But the other cultists were too busy fleeing to pay attention. Whatever deal they'd thought they were making, the entity beneath Chicago had rejected it in favor of something far more apocalyptic. The building shook as the presence in the pit grew stronger, its rage feeding on the terror of the people who tried to use it. "We need to destroy the altars," I said, but my voice was lost in the sound of the city above us beginning to collapse. Through the chamber's walls, I could hear the groaning of steel and concrete as Chicago's skyline buckled under the weight of something that should never have been awakened. Mason was already moving, his silver wire uncoiling as he ran toward the nearest altar. But the moment the wire touched the carved stone, the entire chamber exploded with light and sound. The entity in the pit roared its displeasure, and the floor cracked beneath our feet. "It's too late," Tristan said, staring at his tablet in horror. "The network is cascading. Every ritual site in the city is going critical at once." Through the chamber's ceiling, I could hear the sound of buildings collapsing, of streets splitting open, of a city dying in agony. The ritual hadn't just awakened the hungry dark. It had given it the power to consume everything Chicago had built on top of its prison. But then I remembered Grandpa's final lesson, the one he'd made me promise to never forget. Sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become something worse. I pulled out my phone and called Caleb one last time. "Nolan." His voice was barely audible over the sound of the city's destruction. "The whole downtown is coming apart. Whatever's happening, it's..." "Caleb, I need you to do something for me," I interrupted. "I need you to trigger the emergency demolition charges in the Civic Center." "What? Are you insane? There are people in that building. There are 8 million people in Chicago," I said. "And if we don't stop this thing now, it's going to consume all of them." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of the entity's laughter, a sound like grinding stone and breaking glass. Finally, Caleb spoke. "How long do you need?" 10 minutes, I said. "Give us 10 minutes to get clear." "I'll give you 5. The line went dead, and I turned to Mason and Tristan. "We need to go. Now." But Mason was staring at the pit, his face pale with realization. "Nolan, if we bring down the building while that thing is partially manifested, we'll just spread the contamination. The collapse will scatter its essence across the entire city. Then we need to force it back into the pit first," I said. "We need to reverse the ritual." "How?" Tristan demanded. "The network is too powerful. We can't stop it with silver wire and folklore." I looked at the 13 altars, at the streams of ichor flowing toward the central pit, at the patterns grandpère had taught me to recognize, and I realized what we had to do. "We don't stop the ritual," I said. "We redirect it. Instead of feeding the entity, we make it feed on itself." Mason's eyes widened with understanding. "A feedback loop. If we can reverse the flow of the ichor, make it carry the entity's own energy back into the altars, it'll be like hooking a generator to its own power source," Tristan finished. "The overload will either destroy it or force it back into dormancy, and probably kill us in the process," I added. "But at least Chicago will survive." The building shook again, and through the chamber's walls, I could hear the sound of Caleb's voice on the emergency radio frequencies, coordinating the final evacuation of downtown. He was buying us time with his own life, trusting that we could stop the thing that was tearing his city apart. "How do we reverse the flow?" Mason asked. I looked at the silver wire in his hands, at the altars arranged in their complex pattern, at the entity in the pit that was growing stronger with each passing second. And I thought of grandpère's words. Sometimes the greatest protection comes from the greatest sacrifice. "We use ourselves as the conduit," I said. "We complete the circuit. The ritual drowned downtown in ichor and steel, but maybe, just maybe, we could still save what was left of Chicago from the hungry dark." His blood stained the runes. The demolition charges detonated at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the Convergence Initiative's planned completion of the primary ritual. The explosion shook the entire Loop District, a controlled collapse that sent the Civic Center's upper floors pancaking down into the ritual chamber below. But we were already running. Mason had grabbed the silver wire and sprinted for the emergency exit the moment I'd hung up on Caleb. Tristan followed, his construction tablet clutched against his chest as he navigated the maze of corridors he'd helped design. I brought up the rear, casting one last look at the pit where the hungry dark writhed in rage at being cheated of its full manifestation. The entity's roar followed us through the collapsing building, a sound like tectonic plates grinding against each other. The phosphorescent veins in the walls flared brighter, then began to dim as the falling concrete severed the connections between the primary altar and the network of ritual sites throughout the city. We made it to the service entrance just as the building's facade began to buckle. Mason's truck was still running in the alley, its windshield now completely spider-barreled from the constant tremors. We threw ourselves inside and peeled out as the Civic Center's brutalist architecture folded in on itself like a house of cards. "Did it work?" Tristan shouted over the sound of crashing concrete and twisted steel. "Did we stop it?" I looked back at the collapsing building, at the clouds of dust and debris that were already beginning to obscure the downtown skyline. The phosphorescent glow was fading, the ichor streams drying up, the supernatural tremors giving way to the more mundane shaking of a controlled demolition. "The primary altar is destroyed," I said. "But the network..." My phone rang. Caleb's number. "Nolan." His voice was weak, strained. "The building's down. Whatever you did in there, it's working. The structural failures are stabilizing." "Caleb, where are you?" I could hear sirens in the background, the sound of emergency vehicles converging on the disaster zone. "Command post, Navy Pier. I'm coordinating the search and rescue operations." There was a pause, filled with the sound of labored breathing. "The initial casualty reports are better than we feared. Most of the downtown area was evacuated before the worst of the collapses." "You saved the city," I said. "You bought us the time we needed." "We all did." Another pause. "Nolan, I need you to get to Northwestern Memorial. There's something you need to see." The line went dead. Northwestern Memorial Hospital was in chaos. The emergency room was packed with victims of the earthquake. People with cuts from broken glass, broken bones from falling debris, respiratory problems from inhaling the dust clouds that had engulfed downtown. But the real horror was in the trauma wing, where they'd brought the victims of the ichor exposure. The nurse who led us to the isolation ward was pale and shaking. "We don't know what to call it," she said. "The substance that was leaking from the buildings. It's not chemically identifiable, but it's causing cellular breakdown in anyone who came into direct contact with it." Through the observation window, I could see a dozen patients in varying stages of dissolution. Their skin had taken on the same phosphorescent quality as the ritual sites, and their bodies were slowly breaking down into the same dark ichor that had poured from Chicago's foundations. "How long?" I asked. "Hours," the nurse said. "Maybe less. We've tried everything: dialysis, blood transfusions, even experimental treatments. Nothing works. It's like the substance is rewriting their cellular structure from the inside out." That's when I saw him. Mason was in the third bed from the window, his construction clothes replaced by a hospital gown that couldn't hide the phosphorescent veins spreading across his skin. His eyes were closed, but I could see the steady rise and fall of his chest. He was still alive, but the ichor was consuming him from within. "When did they bring him in?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. 20 minutes ago, the nurse said. He was found in the wreckage of the Civic Center. He'd been exposed to massive amounts of the substance, but he was still conscious when the rescue team found him. He kept saying something about completing the circuit. I pressed my hand against the observation window, watching my brother's slow dissolution. The silver wire he'd been carrying had burned through his skin where it touched the ichor, creating a network of cauterized wounds that pulsed with the same rhythm as the failing ritual sites. "He stayed behind," I whispered. "When the building started to collapse, he stayed behind to complete the reversal." Tristan stood beside me, his face grim. "The feedback loop. He used himself as the conduit, didn't he? He let the entity's own energy flow through him to short-circuit the network. Grandpère always said that the greatest protection comes from the greatest sacrifice," I said. "Mason understood that." "Dr. Cormier?" The nurse's voice was gentle. "He's been asking for you. The patients don't usually retain consciousness this long, but he's been fighting to stay awake. He says he has something to tell you." I followed her into the isolation ward, past the other victims of the ichor exposure. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone and something else. Something that reminded me of the deep places beneath Chicago where things that should never have been awakened had slept for centuries. Mason's eyes opened when I approached his bed. They were still clear, still human, though the phosphorescent veins had spread across his face like a network of infected blood vessels. "Nolan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I did it. I completed the circuit." "I know," I said, taking his hand. His skin was cold, but I could feel the energy flowing through him. Not the malevolent hunger of the hungry dark, but something else. Something that felt like Grandpère's wards. "The network isn't destroyed," Mason continued. "It's changed, purified. The ichor, it's not carrying the entity's hunger anymore. It's carrying the protection patterns." I looked at the phosphorescent veins in his skin, and suddenly I understood. The silver wire hadn't just burned him. It had transformed him into a living ward, a conduit for the protective patterns that Grandpère had taught us to carve into stone and metal. "The ritual sites," I said. "They're not summoning anymore. They're protecting." Mason nodded weakly. "Chicago is safe. The seals are stronger than they've ever been. But the network, it needs a guardian. Someone to maintain the flow, to keep the protection patterns active." "Mason, no. There has to be another way. We can find a cure, we can." "There is no cure," he said. "The ichor doesn't just change your body, Nolan. It changes what you are. I'm not dying. I'm becoming something else. Something that can stand guard over the deep places." He squeezed my hand, and I felt the warmth of Grandpère's protection flowing through him one last time. "Promise me," he said. "Promise me you'll maintain the wards. Teach others how to recognize the signs. The hungry dark is contained, but it's not gone. It's just sleeping again, and sleep doesn't last forever. I promise, I said. Mason smiled, and the phosphorescent veins in his skin pulsed brighter. Good. Now go. There's still work to do. I left the hospital as the first rays of dawn began to filter through the dust clouds that hung over Chicago. The city was wounded but alive, its skyline forever changed by the night's events. The Civic Center was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble that would become a monument to the people who died stopping the Convergence Initiative's mad scheme. But beneath the rubble, I knew the new network was already beginning to function. The ritual sites throughout the city were no longer bleeding ichor. They were weeping something cleaner, something that would seep into Chicago's foundations and strengthen the barriers between the world above and the hungry darkness below. Tristan was waiting for me outside the hospital, his construction tablet showing readings that confirmed what Mason had told me. The network was stable, self-sustaining, protected by the sacrifice of the man who'd understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become something greater. What now? Tristan asked. I looked at the city spread out before us, wounded, changed, but still standing. Now we rebuild, and we make sure this never happens again. How? I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my contacts. Historians, archaeologists, folklorists, people who understood that the past never truly dies, that the things we bury have a way of clawing back to the surface. We form our own organization, I said. We document the sites, maintain the wards, and teach others to recognize the signs. The Convergence Initiative thought they could control the darkness by feeding it. We'll do better. We'll starve it. His blood stained the runes, but in staining them, Mason had transformed them from instruments of summoning into barriers of protection. Chicago was safe, but the price of that safety was written in phosphorescent veins beneath the city's foundations. The hungry dark still slept in the deep places, but now it slept behind stronger bars. And if it ever woke again, it would find the children of Chicago's protectors waiting for it, armed with silver wire and the knowledge that the greatest darkness can only be defeated by the greatest light. Day 30 Final Report. The Earth weeps venom. The Earth weeps venom, but the wards endure in the rubble. 1 month after the Convergence Initiative's ritual tour through Chicago's heart, I stand in what used to be the Loop District, watching the city rebuild itself around the scars we couldn't heal. The Civic Center is gone, replaced by a memorial park where phosphorescent flowers bloom in patterns that mirror grandparents' protective wards. The tourists think it's just an unusual landscaping choice. They have no idea they're walking over the grave of something that once hungered to devour their world. The official story is still catastrophic seismic event, though the geological surveys can't explain why the earthquake epicenter was directly beneath a building that had been constructed on solid bedrock. The conspiracy theorists have their own explanations: government cover-up, corporate malfeasance, terrorist attack. They're not entirely wrong, but they're missing the point. The real story is written in the foundations of every building that survived the ritual network's activation. Where once there had been ordinary concrete and steel, there are now veins of something that the city engineers call mineral intrusion. Crystalline formations that glow faintly in the dark and seem to strengthen the structures they inhabit. The buildings are more stable now, more resistant to both natural and supernatural threats. They're protected by Mason's blood, by the sacrifice that transformed a summoning network into a barrier that will endure for centuries. Dr. Cormier? The voice belongs to Sarah Thoreson, a graduate student in archaeology who's been helping me document the changed sites. The readings from the Willis Tower are consistent with the others. The crystalline formations are definitely artificial, but they're integrated with the building structure at a molecular level. I nod, making notes in the leather journal that's replaced my digital devices. Technology has become unreliable near the protected sites. Cameras malfunction, phones lose signal, computers crash without warning. But the old methods still work. Pen and paper, hand-drawn maps, measurements taken with tools that don't depend on circuits or batteries. Any signs of expansion? Asked. The formations are stable, Sarah confirms. But they're definitely alive. They respond to structural stress, growing stronger when the buildings are under pressure. It's like they're actively protecting the infrastructure. Like Mason, I think but don't say. Always watching, always protecting, even when it costs him everything. The Chicago Protection Initiative, our official name now that we've received city and federal funding, has documented 47 sites where the ritual network's reversal created permanent changes. Churches where stained glass windows now glow with protective patterns. Schools where playground equipment has been subtly reinforced with crystalline growths. Hospitals where the very air seems to heal faster than it should. Chicago is becoming something new, something that exists in the space between the mundane world and the deep places where ancient hungers sleep. The hungry dark is still down there, contained but not destroyed, and it will always be hungry. But now it feeds on its own rage, trapped in a loop of self-consumption that grows stronger with each passing day. The price of that protection is written in the medical files of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, in the isolation ward where 12 people slowly transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. Most of them died within the first week, their bodies unable to sustain the changes the I-Corps had wrought. But 3 survived, including Mason, though survived isn't the right word for what they became. They're guardians now, beings that exist primarily in the spaces between the protective sites, maintaining the network that keeps Chicago safe. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them. A figure in a construction worker's hard hat walking through walls. A woman in a business suit whose footsteps leave phosphorescent traces on concrete. A man whose eyes glow with the same light as the Memorial Park's flowers. They're not ghosts. They're something else. Something that grandpa's folklore never quite prepared me for. They're the living embodiment of the wards themselves, protectors who chose to become protection. I visit Mason every week, though finding him requires a different approach than it used to. The isolation ward at Northwestern Memorial has been converted into a research facility, where scientists study the changes the I-Corps exposure created. But the real Mason isn't there anymore. He's everywhere, woven into the fabric of Chicago's transformed infrastructure. Sometimes I feel him when I'm documenting the sites, a presence that guides my hand as I sketch the protective patterns, whispers corrections when I misidentify a ward configuration. He's teaching me the way grandpa taught him, passing down knowledge that can't be found in any textbook. Today, I'm at the Memorial Park, not for research but for remembrance. It's been 1 month since the ritual network collapsed. 1 month since Chicago learned that the monsters in the dark are real, and that sometimes the only way to stop them is to become something monstrous in return. The park is beautiful in its own way, though beauty seems inadequate to describe something that grows from such profound sacrifice. The phosphorescent flowers bloom in mathematical precision, their patterns creating ward circles that extend deep into the earth. Children play among them, laughing as they chase fireflies that aren't quite natural, their parents unaware that their games are strengthening the barriers between worlds. Dr. Cormier? I turn to find Caleb Valancourt approaching, his arm still in a sling from the injuries he sustained during the evacuation. He's walking with a cane now, the result of being too close to the Civic Center when the demolition charges detonated. But he's alive. Against all odds, he's alive. Caleb, I say, closing my journal. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a building, he says with a grim smile. Which technically I did. But I wanted to thank you. The City Council approved the funding for your initiative. Full federal backing, too. Homeland Security is very interested in your geological anomaly research. They don't know what they're really funding, I say. No, they don't. But they know that Chicago is safer now than it's ever been. Crime rates are down, structural failures are virtually non-existent, and we haven't had a single unexplained death since the seismic event. Whatever you and your brother did, it worked. I look at the Memorial Park, at the patterns of light that pulse beneath the surface of the earth. Mason did it. All of it. I just carry on. That's what survivors do, Caleb says. We carry on. We remember. We make sure it doesn't happen again. And if it does, If something like the Convergence Initiative tries to break the seals again, Caleb's expression hardens. Then we'll be ready. The city has protocols now, contingency plans. And we have you and your people watching for the signs. He's right, of course. The Chicago Protection Initiative has grown from my solitary research into a network of archaeologists, historians, engineers, and emergency responders who understand that the past isn't dead and that the things we bury have a way of clawing back to the surface. We're not just documenting the protected sites, we're preparing for the next threat, the next group of people who think they can bargain with the darkness. Because there will be a next time. There always is. Tristan approaches from the other side of the park, his construction tablet replaced by a hand-drawn map of the protected sites. He's become our primary liaison with the city's infrastructure department, using his knowledge of the ritual network's construction to help plan new buildings that will integrate with the protective barriers. The foundation work for the new civic center is complete, he reports. The crystalline formations have already begun to form around the support pillars. The building will be ready for occupancy within 6 months, and the basement levels sealed permanently. The ritual chamber is buried under 30 feet of concrete and steel, but the protective barriers are holding. Nothing will ever break through from below. I nod, making notes in my journal. The new civic center will be beautiful, a monument to Chicago's resilience and a fortress against the threats that sleep beneath the city. But it will also be a reminder of the price we paid for that protection, of the people who chose to become something more than human so that humanity could endure. As the sun sets over Chicago's transformed skyline, I feel Mason's presence more strongly than usual. He's here, in the patterns of light that dance through the Memorial Park, in the crystalline formations that strengthen the city's bones, in the very air that carries the whispers of protective wards. He's not gone. He's just different, distributed, woven into the fabric of the city he died to protect. Thank you, I whisper to the growing darkness. For everything. The phosphorescent flowers pulse brighter for a moment, and I know he's heard me. The earth weeps venom where the ritual network bled ichor into Chicago's foundations, but the wards endure in the rubble. They will endure long after I'm gone. Long after the people who remember the truth have passed into legend. The hungry dark still sleeps in the deep places, but it sleeps behind stronger bars now. And if it ever wakes again, it will find the children of Chicago's protectors waiting for it, armed with silver wire and the knowledge that the greatest darkness can only be defeated by the greatest light. The city is safe. The price was higher than we ever imagined, but the city is safe, and that's worth everything. Final report, Chicago Protection Initiative. Dr. Nolan Cormier, Director. Day 30 post-event. The earth weeps venom, but the wards endure in the rubble.